Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us during Johns Hopkins Alumni Weekend Goes Virtual 2021 for our Hopkins Retrospective. My name is Susan DeMuth, and I am the Associate Vice President for Alumni Engagement and Annual Giving. The Reunion and Homecoming Office is pleased to bring you this session today. We will be recording the session for those folks who were unable to join us. And if I may just make a comment that it is very windy here in Baltimore. And so some of our internet may be unstable, and we apologize in advance for any inconvenience that might present. Our session today centers on the work being done by two Hopkins projects. The first is Hopkins Retrospective, a program launched by President Daniels in 2013. Hopkins Retrospective's mission is to research and explore facets of the university's history in greater depth and to share these efforts with the community in meaningful ways. The program encompasses a range of initiatives like student research fellowships, online and in-person exhibits, oral histories, and the gathering of archival records from community members like alumni, students, and faculty. The next is JHU Hard Histories. Launched in the fall of 2020, the Hard Histories at Hopkins Project examines the role that racism and discrimination have played at Johns Hopkins. Blending research, teaching, public engagement, and the creative arts, Hard Histories aims to engage our broadest communities at Johns Hopkins and in Baltimore in a frank and informed exploration of the myths that have become part of our university story, and to offer evidence of how race and racism have shaped Johns Hopkins. This session features Dr. Martha S. Jones and Allison Seyler. During today's session, we will also hear from two undergraduate student presenters, Eliza Zimmerman and Kevin LaMonica. Allison Seyler, who I hope is able to join us, I know she was having a little bit of internet issue, is an archivist and public historian who currently works as the Hopkins Retrospective Program Manager here at Johns Hopkins University. Her research, both as a graduate student at UMBC and archivist on the Legacy of Slavery team at the Maryland State Archives, has been rooted in exploring how historians can illuminate ordinary people's experiences using archival records. Dr. Martha S. Jones is the Hard Histories Project Director at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, as well as a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. Her work centers on the legal and cultural history of Black Americans in the United States and how they have shaped American democracy. Our format today will be as follows. Allison Seyler and Dr. Jones will be in a conversation together for about 20 minutes. Then we will play a pre-recorded video featuring the research of two students in Dr. Jones's undergraduate research lab class on hard histories. Finally, we will have an audience Q&A. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function. We should also mention that live captioning is available directly through Zoom. And with that, thank you both for being here, and I'll turn the conversation over to Allison and Dr. Jones and see you all at the end of the discussion.
Thanks so much for getting us started. I do just want to reiterate that we are in the midst of quite a storm in Baltimore. So for those of you who are tuning in remotely, bear with us. But I'm very happy to be here this afternoon with my wonderful colleague from Hopkins Retrospective, Allison Seyler. And it's good to see you, Allison. I'm glad the internet is cooperating over where you are.
Hi, Martha. Thank you so much. We actually just had a large tree fall down in our backyard. So, but we'll continue as as planned for this evening. Just thank you to Susan and also Dr. Jones for being here with me this evening. I am really excited for this conversation, and I'll just get us started by sort of posing some questions for us. One of the questions that I have, and is always sort of in my mind, is related to our respective projects. And so perhaps I'll ask your opinion first on this. What do you see as shared goals between Hopkins Retrospective and the Hard Histories Project? And where and how would you say maybe those goals differ?
Yeah. I guess the first thing to say is that I think what we've discovered is a fundamental, I think, foundational shared commitment to exacting, committed, dogged even archival research as an approach to thinking about and rethinking the history of the university and the stories it tells about itself. I think it's one of the ways that you and I kind of bonded early on in this work, is that we both share a real passion for the archive, in fact, and we've even how could I put it? We've even walked the same path at places like the Maryland State Archives. So I think that this is so foundational to the work we're doing, but I sense that it's also at the core of what you're doing at Hopkins Retrospective.
Sure. Yeah, I think I would just add, from my vantage point, Hopkins Retro has really been focused on building and widening the scope of archival records that, we collect and share within the university archives. So that's one way in which I see the project sort of differing. We're really committed to raising awareness of the records within our collection, but also communicating with students that they are also part of this history, and sort of the imperative and interest of students to share their records with us, whether that's from a student organization or something like that. I've always interpreted Hopkins Retro as this public history project that shares the history of the university with the community in meaningful ways. And I think the students are a huge part of that. I also think that involves programming and social media feeds and sort of interactions like this that we have today. And so I think, the ways in which the programs differ are there, but I also think, we are very focused and driven on involving students. And so we're operating these sort of complementary collaborative projects, which, is different. And I think there's actually not a lot of universities that have these sort of sister components, if you will.
Mm-hmm. As I'm listening to you, part of what I'm thinking about, is the way in which maybe Hard Histories is a more intentionally a more interpretive project in many ways, which is to say that our mission is in some ways, I think, a critical one, but very specific, which is to look at the kinds of stories that we have long told about ourselves as an institution, and come at them anew, to come at them as good, thoughtful, critical thinkers, and then to do new sorts of research. And I'll say that one of the things that has mattered, and we'll see in a little while, is bringing students into that process and to let their critical thinking inform sort of what myths trouble them, right? What stories to them are unsatisfying or incomplete, are not working, and how can we use their experience as sort of new 21st century members of the university community. How can we use their perspectives to, in part, drive research questions?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've been incredibly appreciative of, and I would say is like a triumph of doing and engaging in this work, is actually the students' reactions and their sort of engagement with this story and sort of this investigative work. On that note, I would really love to ask you if there's any specific archival or research discoveries that you'd want to share with the audience today. And I know, I also just want to reiterate how thankful and grateful we are to, the archival institutions that sort of support us in this work, specifically citing the Maryland State Archives and also the Maryland Center for History and Culture for really providing us with records digitally, making appointments available when they can, during pandemic era, and with the horizon of reopenings, particularly with more folks being vaccinated, that will actually be able to get into the reading rooms again. But I just would love if there's anything you'd like to share with us this evening as progress in our research.
Sure. One of the things that we knew from the outset in this work was that there was going to be very little material that was going to come out of something like we might think of as Mr. Hopkins Archive or the Hopkins Family Archive. That those materials were by and large already well known, that they were limited, whether by accident or mishap or by design. And so part of what we've been doing is sort of combing some of those fundamental collections, like manumission records for Anne Arundel in Baltimore County, like the records of indentures and apprenticeships in those counties as well. Yes, for what little evidence we might discover about Mr. Hopkins and his family, but I think it turns out more importantly, giving context to some of the materials that we already have that have for a long time sat in a kind of isolation, right, without really any sense of how they fit into the broader world of slavery and bound labor and emancipation and more in Maryland. So we'll hear in a little bit from one of the students who's been working on the indenture materials and how she's used that to contextualize our materials. But, we were never intended to dwell forever on the question of this early history. And so we've also had students who were looking to contextualize some of the parameters of Mr. Hopkins's bequest, his vision in particular for the hospital, and what it means, for example, to provide for separate institutions or separate wards for Black Americans in Baltimore during the 1870s. And that has given us, I think, a much fuller picture of what I think in the 1870s folks would have referred to as separation, but we come to understand as segregation, and the ways in which the hospital fits into a city that is remaking itself in the wake of slavery's abolition, but very quickly into a place that is segregated in many public spaces along a color line. If that happens much later in other parts of the South, it happens very early in Baltimore, and that's been part of what we've discovered. One more bit, and that is we also were fascinated by the very little we knew about the very first African-American student at Hopkins, Kelly Miller. So part of what we've learned is much more deeply about Miller's life in the city of Baltimore and how it fit in, how he fit into the African-American political culture and community that he was a part of. And we've even managed to track down the elusive first Black student to express an interest in enrolling at Hopkins, someone who is not provided the opportunity to attend even before Kelly Miller, but the gentleman who becomes Reverend J.W.E. Bowen, someone whose name we didn't know for a long time. We can now appreciate the ways in which these men were not simply singular figures. They tell us a lot about how and why it was that Hopkins remained a segregated institution for such a very long time, long into the 20th century. So I'm shorthanding it, but I want to give people a sense of the scope of the work that the students have been doing this semester.
I appreciate that. I think you touched on one point that, I think anyone who's done minimal history work or is interested in history is that it is really difficult to interpret documents as a standalone, as a standalone item. And it feels especially weird not to be able to sort of discuss these in person and with one another in a more public setting as historians might. And so I'm excited that the students have been able to engage in that, at least in a virtual seminar room. I think that that's really important for their experience at Hopkins and part of the things that Hopkins Retro hopes for and seeks to support. I also just wanted to discuss briefly some of those sort of archival challenges, that we feel we might face. I think from my perspective, one of the biggest challenges, as you mentioned, was this dearth of materials written by Hopkins himself, or even about Hopkins within governmental records. Sometimes people are really easy to trace through public records, and sometimes they're not. And so I think it's very difficult for us to know, what the situation was in his household in 1840 and 1850 without having a document written by him sort of expressing, the inner workings of his life or his day-to-day activities. And so I just reiterate to folks that, that is one of the most difficult challenges when doing archival research. And then one of the things that I think is really important that has happened since our announcement in December is the release and sharing of the Hopkins Family Collection, which is linked in our chat. And just a huge shout out to the Sheridan Library's digitization team for getting these scanned and getting them up online. It's a small trove of letters and photographs. And some of the letters were written by Hopkins himself, as well as some of his family members. And some of them, the letters, Martha and I, we both looked at them, and some of them are quite lengthy. I mean, his mother, Hannah, was very verbose, was very expressive. And so I think those are documents that are crucial to this research. And they take a bit of time to read and transcribe and sort of review because of the way in which, they're handwritten. So, I think that portion requires a bit of work before then we're able to actually do a deep interpretation of things. And I would just add that in the collection, there's actually some fascinating photographs. So if you're curious to see, some old photos of folks, check out the collection. Basically, all of them are unidentified, which is also another frustrating archival challenge. But we can assume that some of them are family members and others may be close acquaintances of the Hopkins family. So, I just wanted to mention that. But are there any other archival challenges that you might mention in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the good news for the kind of work we've been doing is that the materials, for example, at the Maryland State Archives are voluminous, and that means that there is a lot of labor that has been devoted this semester to not only finding those materials, but then reading them, transcribing them, so that we're reading them accurately and well, and we can share them in the working group. And then the volume, you'll hear Eliza Zimmerman talk in a little while about her challenges reading hundreds and hundreds of indenture contracts to begin to contextualize that single indenture contract that we have in our own collection, executed in 1807 by Samuel Hopkins and a woman we know only by one name, Phyllis. Eliza has to sort through hundreds of such contracts in order to begin to read that critically and to think about what it tells us about the Hopkins household at the beginning of the 19th century. You know, the great fortune of the kind of way we've organized the lab is that each semester we have a new team of eager student researchers, but we also are challenged by a 14-week schedule. And in these weeks now, students are turning away from the raw archives and beginning to construct final projects that will kind of memorialize some of their interpretive findings. It's just to say there's a lot to do. It's great. It's a wonderful problem to have, but it's a challenge.
Yes, there's a lot of things to juggle, I think, and it's easy to lose your place. So it's very important that these students are able to contextualize and provide, you know, a starting point for the next semester students as well. So I know we are primed to sort of have our students share the students' presentations with our audience. But I just wanted to ask, you know, a final question or offer just a minute or two for you to sort of set up the presentations and this idea of the history lab, because I think that's really important here. And I'd love for you to sort of maybe tell us why you thought the history lab was a good mechanism for this research.
Mm-hmm. You know, for me, one of the guiding principles in any work I do at the university is the notion that among the things we do very well is teach, is educate. And we are researchers, we are writers, we are many things, but we're educators. And so to me, it was important to link this important research to a pedagogical end, to bring students in for their critical thinking, for their insights, but also to let them have the experience of wading through those hundreds of indenture contracts over the course of many weeks and even months, because part of what we're laying the foundation for, right, is research that will perhaps be in no way tethered to the questions we're asking at Hopkins Retro or at Hard Histories, but help students discover their own capacities, their own curiosities, their own strengths as researchers. As an undergraduate, I was a biopsychology major and I worked in a lab with weaker electric fish. You might think that has nothing to do with being a historian, but it taught me my capacity to work for long hours alone in a dark lab, right? You know, with these creatures, recording data. That is kind of one of those foundational capacities of what it means to be a researcher, is that extraordinary experience of being alone with your questions and with raw materials. And so I hope our students have discovered some of the researcher in themselves through this experience. And I'm really thrilled that we're able to share some of their experiences and thinking with everybody this afternoon.
Thank you so much for that. I think it really articulates, you know, perfectly what we're trying to do and sort of how we're trying to create, you know, a future and conversations where students are really engaged. So thank you for that. I think that now we can turn to our pre-recorded student presentation.
So welcome. to this conversation with Eliza Zimmerman and Kevin LaMonica, students in the spring 2021 Hard Histories at Hopkins lab. Eliza and Kevin are two of the 8 Krieger School students who've been conducting archival research in an effort to shed new light and provide context for new questions about Mr. Hopkins and his family and how they fit with the histories of slavery, indentured labor, and segregation in Maryland and at Johns Hopkins. Our team has worked this semester in 3 units. The first team on the history of slavery, manumission, and indentured labor, along with slave narratives in Anne Arundel County and Baltimore. The second team worked on the post-Civil War era of Reconstruction and the institutionalization of segregation in Baltimore City. And the third team has examined the short but important tenure of student Kelly Miller at Johns Hopkins, looking at both the campus climate and the Black community in Baltimore, of which Kelly Miller was a part. So I want to thank Eliza and Kevin for being with me today. I've got some questions for each of you about your research, and then we'll end with a question about your reflections and how you think that the work we are doing this semester can or should inform the ways we think about the present of our life and our work as a university community. So thanks again, you two, for being with us. Eliza, I'm going to start with you, if I could, and say welcome. And I'm sharing now on the screen one document from the many that have been at the center of your research. We started your work with this 1807 indenture contract signed between Samuel Hopkins, the father of Johns Hopkins, and a woman known only to us by one name, Phyllis. These two enter into an agreement in which Phyllis agrees to commit the labor and the lives of her 2 young sons to Mr. Hopkins until they are 21. They are going to receive meat, drink, clothes, washing, lodging, and other requisite necessaries, as the contract says, though not instruction in reading and writing. That provision is crossed out of this agreement in exchange for teaching them what this contract calls the art of planting. And finally, a suit of clothes when they reach 21 and they are released finally from this contract. Eliza, one of our first questions was how to give some context to this contract. And we read Stephen Whitman's book, The Price of Freedom, to know more about this. Could you say a little bit about, introduce yourself, first of all, if you don't mind, and then can you say some about the way in which Professor Whitman's book helped you to frame your work on the indenture contracts?
Yeah, of course. So my name's Eliza. I am a 2nd-year sociology and writing student at Hopkins. And when reading The Price of Freedom, I think what was really helpful was understanding enslavement and the process of someone perhaps moving from enslavement to freedom, less as a sort of moving from a total institution to completely being outside that institution, which I think is the way that enslavement is really conceptualized in America, at least now when we look back at it, but within actually like a legal framework where you could go from enslavement to freedom, but in the case perhaps of the woman in the indentured contract, Hopkins not have the money to care for your children because of the position that you were put in society. And so then having to indenture your children out until they were 21 years old. That was very common, especially among Black mothers, because if their children were found not doing work, being sort of idle, they could be taken by the courts. And so it was more common for Black mothers to indenture their children out to do manual labor because that was a way of protecting them and ensuring that they had food and clothing. So I think seeing the institution of slavery and enslavement in a legal framework and sort of almost as a gradient between enslavement and freedom, that there existed these sort of unsure, tentative spots where people existed, was helpful not only in understanding the reality of what it was like or what society was framed at in the early 19th century, but also in combating, I think, the sort of idea of enslavement as a total institution, that you were either enslaved or not, and it was disconnected from the legal system, separates us from that institution because it seems like such a sort of primitive bygone era where like the law was so all telling and it really, you were either without control or entirely in control. And I think understanding it in the full legal framework and the implications of that, and where there was occasionally some room for Black Americans and formerly enslaved people to articulate their own autonomy and their own position within those contracts, actually brings them more towards the present, and you can understand the ways in which the ramifications of this institution have continued to this day. These indentured contracts that were very exploitative of young Black children continued after the Civil War for a short period of time before that they were abolished. And they were basically an attempt to continue the institution of slavery after it was abolished. So I think understanding it in that way was really helpful, that it wasn't just you were enslaved or you were an entirely free person, but that it often wasn't so black and white for individuals moving out of enslavement.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important perspective, just as you say, because we might come to these materials thinking that slavery and freedom are an either or proposition. And Whitman so vividly and with such detail, using things like indenture contracts, is able to show us how wide the gray area was in a state like Maryland. And this contract, I think, with Phyllis and her sons is an important illustration. So tell us, if you would, a little bit about your research. I know that you worked in materials from the Maryland State Archives, records of the Orphans Court, where many indenture contracts were recorded. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you approached the research, and then help us to use what you've done to give some context to this single contract that's in our collection, which tells us some things, but doesn't tell us enough about the practice. You've looked now at, I dare say, hundreds of contracts. So tell us a little bit about that and what you discovered and how you think it might help us think better about this contract that we have between Samuel Hopkins and Phyllis.
Yeah, of course. So essentially what I've been doing is I've been reviewing indentured contracts largely from the 1790s to 1820, and that's what I'll be focusing on talking about today, because the contract that we're looking at, I believe, is from 1807, the one that is in the Hopkins family. So I've been reviewing these contracts, and they're almost more standardized than the Hopkins one. They're the final drafts usually of these contracts, so you don't see as much the negotiation. The clause about, the young boys being taught to read and write, being crossed out in the Hopkins contract is not something you would typically find in the contracts I'm looking for, because they're the final contract that's being put into the archives, and all the negotiation has already been sorted out between the two parties. So when I've been looking at these contracts, there's sort of two scripts that are noted. One is, I call it script A because it's the one that I came across first and found the most, especially in the 1790s to early 1800s. And that will be, the contract is between I'll refer to them in this as the master because they're the person that the person is being indentured to, and they're referred to as a master in the script. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that use of the word, but I think for clarity, I'll be using it. So it was between the master and typically the parent with the consent of the child, and they'll note that in the legal framework. That's script A. There's a lot of stipulations in script A for what is expected of the child. The script A will raise the quote master almost to the position of a god. There's a lot of talk about being faithful to them, protecting their secrets, everything as long as what the master is doing is lawful. The indenture or the apprentice will protect those secrets and protect that business. There's also usually a couple lines about not going to a tavern or an alehouse, not fornicating before marriage, and not marrying during the contract. And that's sort of typical. Usually these contracts are for young boys, and like the contract with the Hopkins family, usually those young boys are in the contract until they're 21. Sometimes there are girls, those girls will go until usually they're 16, and then they will leave their contracts. So that's script A, which we're not dealing with. Script B is the one that is the Hopkins contract, and that is by a sort of a justice party, so usually the justices of the peace of Anne Arundel County. And this one has much smaller stipulations for what is expected of the child. I would assume because there's not as much of a vested interest by the justices of the peace to be explicit about what is expected of the child, because if a parent has this contract, knows what is expected of their child, and something is happening to their child that is not supposed to happen, they can bring that legally to the court. So they have a vested interest in sort of parsing out that script. It's much like smaller what the justices expect, just that they'll obey their master, very blanket statement, very much up to the interpretation of the master. And that's what you see in this document. Usually these documents are for orphans, although in the case of the Johns Hopkins contract, this contract is also signed by the mother of the two boys. And this is another thing that I found. When the children being indentured are Black, the mother is described as a free Black woman. So I've never found a contract that indicates a Black father. It's usually always co-signed by the free Black woman, the mother. So emphasizing her legal right to sign away her sons to indenture. And as I mentioned before, typically these indentured contracts, as outlined in The Price of Freedom, were ways for Black parents to protect their children from being sort of taken back into more abusive contracts, back into enslavement by the courts of Anne Arundel County if they were found to be sort of like loafing around, didn't have any work. This was sort of a stipulation that wasn't as widely enforced for white children. And this was a large reason for the indenture of Black children after their parents had become free. And when their parents didn't have enough money to pay for them, this was also a good way for to know that their children were being provided for in terms of meat, lodging, and clothing. So this was typical of what would be seen in a contract of a free Black mother. And another thing would be that usually Black, especially young men, would be indentured to farmers, which is very different from the typical white teenage boy or young boy being indentured to, say, a shoemaker or a wheel maker, a wheelwright, a miller. There, these young boys were being apprenticed so that they would learn business skills that they could then use to start a business and build wealth. And in the case of, young Black men or young Black boys being indentured to usually white planters, they were learning the skills of farming, but it's very unlikely that once they got out of that indenture, they would have any money, familial or personally, that they could use to buy their own land. And so really they were just being taught manual labor, and their day-to-day work would likely not be that much different than what it would have been if they were enslaved. So it's sort of a way to continue exploiting Black labor for a shorter period of time, for sort of the most cost-efficient time of having a person work for you when they're, ages 12 to 21, the sort of height of their physical prowess. So you see that in another way of denying Black families wealth because they're not using skills that they can then employ. They're not learning skills that they can then employ to build wealth in the future, and their laborers continue to be exploited in the field by these white plantation owners. So those are a couple of differences. For the later half of the contract, they're pretty similar to other contracts I've seen. Basically, the young boys are guaranteed food, washing, lodging, clothing, that's very typical. That clause doesn't really change person to person. Actually, the giving of suits at the end of their contract, which is something that these young boys are given, is not atypical, but that's usually a room for negotiation in the contracts. And some people are left with nothing. Some people get a suit. Some people get a certain amount of schooling. As we can see in this contract, that schooling clause has been cut out. And I have seen schooling far more included in contracts with presumably white individuals than young Black men and young Black boys. Typically, I don't see that in those contracts. Sort of off the topic, but in contracts with girls, if they're provided schooling, there will be a clause that says if they are so able to learn. And so that's sort of the discretion of whether or not women are able to learn is sort of left up to the person indenturing them. There's really no way to test. So I would say that the main difference that I've come across is the idea of, for white boys, typically these contracts help them build skills that they can then continue on and build wealth later in their life. Whereas for young Black boys, this is sort of a way of continuing to exploit their bodies and their labor through the years where they will be able to be the most productive with manual labor. And so you see again that while it's not enslavement, it's definitely not freedom where they can, use what is given to them in their body for their own benefit. But it's again for the benefit of people owning plantations. They were likely working alongside enslaved people. And we see in sort of the framework of the price of freedom that it's not, it's not a just system in which you are either free or unfree, but there's sort of a gradient in the middle where where your labor is continuing to be exploited.
I want to come back to you in a few minutes and ask you about how this work you think sheds light on the kinds of questions we've been asking. But you are making plain the ways in which there are kind of standardized or stock terms, right? Rote scripts that contract parties are relying upon. And some of your work has been to look at those moments in which the script, the parties depart from the script. And in the case of Mr. Hopkins, it is that moment when the direction that the boys should be taught to read and write is scratched out, that turns out to be a most telling moment because the standard script has been departed from, and somewhere in that transaction that we can't quite see fully is a negotiation, right, that is reflected in that scratching out. So the kind of care that you've been taking with those kinds of details turns out to be so important in our work. So let me turn, if I can, for a few minutes to Kevin and say, welcome, Kevin. It's wonderful to have you here too. Do you want to, I want you to introduce yourself. I know that you've been working on the period that we call Reconstruction, the years just after the Civil War, where importantly, Mr. Hopkins is contemplating and then writing out the terms of his bequest that creates both the university and the hospital. And there were details in that bequest that have been important for our thinking and to the university story for a long time. In particular, the creation of a separate orphanage for so-called colored children, the reference to Black and white wards for patients, but also the admonition, right, that there should be no distinction drawn between patients on account of race and sex or their ability to pay. And we've been wrestling with how to contextualize that. And your work has focused on a parallel story that's unfolding in Baltimore, the story of the development of public education. And among the books that we read was Dennis Halpin's more recent book, A Brotherhood of Liberty, which is about Black Americans and Reconstruction in Baltimore. So could you start by telling us a little bit about that and how that helped to frame your thinking about the archival work you've been doing?
Absolutely. So first off, I'm Kevin LaMonica. I'm also a second-year sociology student like Eliza. However, I am not a writing major. I am an international studies major along with my sociology studies. Halpin's book, I think there were a few things in the book that kind of helped ground where my work was going in what we now understand to be this period of radically reimagining what American democracy really was. We have the passage of 3 amendments, which it was a rethinking of what the nation could be, and it was an experiment in multiracial democracy. And this book really highlights how Maryland and Baltimore was kind of at the epicenter of this. We know that in the antebellum period, Baltimore was the city with the largest population of free Black Americans in the nation. One thing that comes out in this book is how Maryland as a border state starts to develop a different story during the Reconstruction period than we have come to understand about the states of the Deep South. For example, as a border state that never seceded from the Union, Maryland was not subject to the same federal oversight as some of the southern states. So Black Americans did not have access to political power in the same way as they did in North or South Carolina, for example, where we start to see a rapid influx of African Americans being elected to statewide office and starting to do that reimagining of what our democracy could look like, and starting to do the work of righting the wrongs of slavery that had so recently been abolished in the Union. So in Maryland, it was really up to those Black Americans that were in Baltimore City and the other counties of Maryland to, from the ground up, really push to fight off the front lines of Jim Crow, is how I'll describe it. There was a lot of activism, especially centered in Baltimore City, that was pushing off a lot of these the institutionalization of segregation, as you were mentioning, Professor Jones. And you start to see the remnants of a lot of things that will ultimately manifest into institutions that we still see today. There's a whole chapter in the book that focuses specifically on the emergence of a racialized criminal justice system in Baltimore. I think that's really relevant today, as just a week ago, we saw the verdict come out against Derek Chauvin, and the ways in which that those, obviously that's not Maryland, but the ways in which that a criminal justice system has been racialized, and how the Reconstruction period was so critical in the emergence of those racialized things. But ultimately, and we'll talk about this in a second as we dive into the research I've been doing, but I think the biggest takeaway was the agency exercised by these freed Black Americans and the role that they had to play in this reimagining of what America could be, and how, despite the lack of access to political power, they still pushed for this reimagined nation in which they could live free and have access to opportunity and capital. And I guess, for example, in line with the research I've been doing, access to education as well.
It's almost counterintuitive, isn't it, that Maryland, a border state that remained within the Union, does not have the kind of robust reconstruction that we associate with North Carolina, with Louisiana, with Arkansas, that in fact the door closes on the possibility of a true interracial democracy in Maryland very quickly. And still we have places like the Douglas Institute and later the Brotherhood of Liberty that are going to continue to do the work of struggling with what is freedom, what is citizenship, what do civil rights look like for Black Marylanders. But they do it. I think Gilpin does such a great job of showing us they do it under extraordinary constrained circumstances. So let's talk about your research, because I want to hear more about how you approached exploring the story of public education. Is it a story that fits alongside this hospital that Mr. Hopkins is imagining? And how did you go about doing that?
Of course. So a little different than Eliza in the state of the archives, I guess I would call it. I've been diving into mostly newspapers, so looking at and which gives me some insight into what was happening, because the newspapers they report on a wide variety of different things. So a few of the things I've seen are the happenings of the city council, the happenings of the school board. There's this column that appears in the Baltimore Sun very often called Local Matters, which talks about different things that are happening in the city. And oftentimes that will include information about the meetings of free Black Baltimoreans, and specifically with regard to fighting for public education for Black children and other freed African Americans. However, something that I've become, that has kind of enveloped its way into the research I've done that has been really fascinating, has been a lot more with some legal documents as well. So in doing this research, I have come not only to learn the story of education for African Americans in Maryland, but also the story of public education itself, which we don't start to see a statewide system of public education in Maryland until the early 1860s. So public education on a statewide system is something that's new, even as the 13th Amendment is ratified and slavery is abolished in the United States. And the prospect of education for African American children becomes a possibility. But going along with some of the things that are discussed in Halpin's book, The Brotherhood of Liberty, is we start to see almost a parallel track for white children and African American children, as the state does not provide public education at first for Black children. So there's an organization called the Association for the Moral and Educational Improvement of the Colored People that is founded in late 1865, early 1866, that becomes very integral in the education of Black children. The first report that they publish in late 1866 outlines that in that first year of their existence, they had established 33 schools, 16 of which were in Baltimore City. They are employing 35 teachers and teaching about 6,000 students, 3,000 of which are in Baltimore City, the remainder in the various counties of Maryland. So we start to see that this, like Halpin had been talking about in his book, the from the ground up approach to Reconstruction was very much present here in the story of public education as well, in that freed African Americans in Baltimore and the surrounding counties in Maryland became very self-sufficient or self-reliant on to create these systems in which they could be educated. And it wouldn't be until later that we start to see the state begin to provide public education for Black children. One of the important legal documents that I've come to look at is the Public School Law of 1872, which outlines how white children will be educated and also how Black children will be educated in the state of Maryland, and what the governance of that looks like. In that law, it stipulates that Black children and white children kind of almost have the same criteria for entering school, the same age range are to be educated. It sets up not the same system of taxation and then ultimately appropriation for the schools, but parallel. So you start to see both in the newspaper clippings as well as these legal documents, how the story of education for African American children and also adults as well as free enslaved people were not educated when they were enslaved. So if you had a 30-year-old enslaved person who was freed at the end of the Civil War, they also were provided the opportunity to be educated. And then finally, and then I'll kick it back to you, Professor Jones. Something that emerges after that public school law of 1872 and Black children are being provided education by the state itself, the fight begins to shift and evolve from let's educate African Americans to the hiring of African American teachers in the schools. So we start to see in these newspaper clippings, meetings of different groups advocating to the school board the hiring of Black teachers in schools provided for Black children, in the public schools in general, and the fight by these people, not only for the hiring of Black teachers, but specifically for qualified teachers in Black schools, so that the Black students were being afforded the same quality education that the white students were being guaranteed under the state laws and the ordinances passed by the city council and the resolutions passed by the school board as well.
Thank you for that. You know, I think one of the most lasting contributions of the era of Reconstruction, not only in Maryland, but throughout the American South, is finally the establishment of public education. But what your story suggests, at least in Maryland, is that from the outset, those are envisioned as two distinct tracks, as reflected in the politics, but as reflected in the very letter of the law, that Black and white children's education are regarded by distinct provisions and distinct terms. And I think I'm right that in this period, the term that's used is separate, not segregated. That segregation will enter the lexicon much later. But in this period that you're looking at, it's separation that is taking hold. In your research in education, in others in your group, James is looking at the almshouse and separation there, and Ariella, who's looking at public transportation, right, where separation again is the order of the day, even before we get to Jim Crow segregation in the laws that will come later in the century. Thank you so much, Kevin, for this wonderful research and your great analysis. I wanted to bring you both back in just for a few minutes before we wrap up, to give you a chance to talk with folks about how you imagine, how you hope, how you'd push even for us to incorporate what you're learning into our thinking about ourselves as a university community, as Johns Hopkins, as an institution. I think for many folks, your findings are going to be eye-opening and important windows onto the past. But a lot of folks are saying, what are we supposed to do with this? And that's not an easy question. I don't expect either of you to answer it thoroughgoingly, but I am interested in how your own thinking has evolved this semester as you've been on the front lines of doing this research. And can I start with you, Eliza, with that question?
Yeah, so I think specifically to the university, what was enlightening about doing this research was that obviously a ton of commotion, and rightfully so, has come of discovering that Johns Hopkins was an enslaver, and that this was sort of seen in the broader community as sort of opposite of our vision of him, that he had not been an enslaver before, that he maybe had been an abolitionist. And I think understanding the ways that indentured contracts and other things like manumission sort of fill out that gradient between a Black person in America being being enslaved or being free was helpful in seeing that even if that had not come to light, I think our framework of looking, especially at wealthy individuals in the early 19th century, wealthy white individuals specifically, does need to change, because regardless of whether or not he had enslaved someone, he was still using and exploiting Black labor in his family was, not specifically him, obviously this contract is with his father, but his family was still exploiting this labor to their benefit in a legal framework that encouraged them to do so across racial lines. And so I think that the idea of whether or not someone was an enslaver, sort of absolving them of, the really horrible participation in the system of exploitation, is sort of a myth, that regardless, they were still using the wealth built by Black individuals for their own gain and exploiting and sort of stealing that wealth from them. And I think there's a book that we read at the beginning of the semester called Ebony and Ivy that really goes through the history of American universities, especially American universities in the North, and the sort of myth that the North, is a place of freedom, that, maybe they dabbled in enslavement a long time ago, but that's not really relevant to today. Like, we don't really need to talk about that. They were, these institutions could be built because of the wealth generated by enslavement. And so I think thinking about our history, the history of the university and the history of America, is not just this black and white, were they explicitly involved in the institution of slavery or not, but in that everyone, especially wealthy white people, but even, any white person then and today is very involved in a racialized system that benefits them, and that wealth has been built on the backs of exploited Black individuals, I think has been really helpful. And I think also one more thing I'll note about the contract is that the mother's signature is a very tentative X. So not only, people X'd a contract if they couldn't read. Not only could she not read, she hadn't ever really probably signed a contract before, hadn't signed one in many years. And again, thinking about that in terms of the legality of today, and the ways that even if these, this contract was written so that everyone could read it, it wasn't written in a special code, it wasn't written in some secret code that only white people could read, but knowing that it was still inaccessible to her because she hadn't been taught how to read, and because she hadn't been involved in the legal framework, likely someone would have read that contract to the mother. She didn't have any way of corroborating that it said what she said. She likely didn't have a way to be sure that if she brought this contract to court, if something had happened to her sons, that she could prove that they had been done wrong. So understanding that just because there's technically, a legal framework that seems to pit both parties equally, there's still those nuances involved that can allow for exploitation. You think about the Henrietta Lacks case, that technically she had, discarded those cells, and that technically the doctors could use them to do research, but was she given the resources to understand what that meant? Was anyone given those resources? So I think understanding that those inequalities still exist. Again, the denial of Black wealth by indenturing these young boys. They weren't able to build skills that could allow them to earn money after enslavement, after their families were freed. So I think all those things have really shaped my perception of America today and my place in it.
Well, thank you for that. That's a perfect segue to Kevin, and will help us think about the implications for his work on history of separate education in Baltimore City after the war. So thank you. Kevin, how about you? Tell us some about how you've been thinking about not only what you've been finding, but the ways in which you think it is important for how we think about our own time.
Of course. So one of the first things that comes to mind is having studying sociology at Hopkins. One of the things that I've done is two of the areas of sociology that I'm particularly interested in are housing and education. So having the opportunity to research education and from a historical lens, specifically on Baltimore City, has been really fascinating. And one of the really critical things that the connections I'm making in my head is how interconnected the story of housing and education are and will become in the post-Reconstruction era as we enter into the Jim Crow era of American history. And even still today. We know that schools won't legally become desegregated until after Brown v. Board in 1954. And actually, it's years after Brown v. Board until schools actually really become desegregated. And one could argue that even today, they are still segregated. So looking at the history of how this came to be, I think is really, really critical to understanding how a lot of what we're studying in this history lab permeates today. And we still see a lot of it, the remnants of it today. So it provides us with a lot of context and allows us to draw a historical line from that moment in history to this moment in history. As a university, I think it's really critical that we're understanding the history of the founding of the university. You talked earlier briefly about the gift of Mr. Johns Hopkins of the university and the hospital and the segregation, we would the vernacular became the term segregation, but you talked before, separation, the separation of the races in the hospital ward, and how that fits into the story of Reconstruction, but also in that same vein, how we can draw that historical line from that moment to now, and in understanding the experiences of Black and Brown students at Johns Hopkins and how that may be because of the historical legacies of the founding of the university. Unfortunately, me and Eliza, our peers from this class who are studying Kelly Miller, were not able to join us, but understanding the campus climate at the time for the first Black student at Hopkins, he ultimately wouldn't go on to be conferred a doctorate of philosophy, and understanding what some of the reasons for that were. Obviously, we know there were some financial troubles, but were there other parts to that story that maybe we don't know as much about, and how that contributes to the years and years that go by after Kelly Miller leaves Hopkins before we see another African-American student enroll at the university, and the connection that has to the experiences of Black students today, but also understanding the history of the university. I walked down one of the quads on campus, and there's plaques here and there about, well, this used to be a quarters for enslaved people. Understanding that the Homewood campus used to be a plantation itself, which I think also welcomes a broader conversation, as this course and the learning that we're doing through the research isn't necessarily just about Johns Hopkins as a man or as a university or as a hospital, but rather the story of Baltimore City, this city that we live in, the city that we study in, and historically the relationship between the institution in which we are all affiliated with, and the relationship between them and the city itself. And I think it's really important to contextualize that so that we understand some of the issues. And if we're going to be talking about hard histories at Hopkins, I think it's bringing up things like Henrietta Lacks's cells and the unethical use by Johns Hopkins researchers. More recently, there have been conversations about medical debt and the hospital how those things represent the relationship between the institution and the city, and kind of the historical background that maybe that translated into the same things that we're seeing today. So thinking about it historically, what are some continuities and what are some changes over time that we start to see from the research that we're doing, and then through today, and what we're seeing in the present and also going forward?
Thank you for that, Kevin. You and Eliza both have really set the bar high, not only through your research, but by beginning to map out the ways in which this early history that you've been immersed in is indeed connected to the longer story of, yes, the university and the hospital, but also of the city of Baltimore. And as we continue the work, which we will in the fall of 2021 and beyond, we really will be indebted to you all for laying such an important and rich foundation for what we do. So I'm going to, with that, say thanks very much to you both. We appreciate the chance to speak with you today. So I hope folks have a much more powerful or palpable sense of sort of where Alice and I were going back and forth earlier, which is to say there is something remarkable that happens when we put these questions, this skill set, and these raw materials in the hands of our students, and their answers are as unique as are their insights. And so, I'm really thrilled that you had a chance to meet Eliza and Kevin. I'm going to try and turn us, if I could, to the questions that have been coming in. And thanks to everybody who's been dropping their questions in the Q&A. They're making their way to me. And I'm going to try and pose these for both Allison and myself. The first, I'm going to try and group some of them together because they're resonating really well with each other. The first question is a sort of nuts and bolts one, but not unimportant, which is about sort of who's doing the work behind the scenes. One question is about, our colleague Bill Leslie and how his work might fit into what we're doing. And then there's a question about how many students are working on that. So why don't I ask you, if I could, Allison, to talk about Bill Leslie, and then I could talk a little bit about students.
Sure. Thank you so much for that. And I, again, extend my gratitude to your students for their wonderful presentations. It's always exciting to see, budding historians, even if they are not history majors. So just to let our alum know, I know everyone has had the wonderful experience of encountering Bill Leslie, and he's presented for many of our Hopkins Retro Alumni Weekend events. Bill and I are both working together collaboratively still for Hopkins Retro. In fact, he's actually teaching a course this semester. I should say he's writing and teaching every day, all day. And he's teaching a course this semester about campus life then and now. And so he's been engaged with students doing research about university history, what life was like for students on campus through the years. And we're actually getting ready to engage in a sort of the students have put together some presentations, some virtual projects, and the archives and special collections team are gonna provide some feedback for them. So I would say that he's still very much involved in Hopkins Retro. I like to see I like to explain our relationship very much as a collaborative one, where Bill has been undergoing and undertaking many oral history interviews for support of his research and his new forthcoming book. So that is one area where Hopkins Retro has supported him and also, been able to add to the archival record by adding some oral history interviews to our treasure trove. So excuse me, just to clarify, Bill is still very much involved in the project, and I very much enjoy working with him. So I will let him know he got a shout out today. He'll be really pleased.
Well, and we're all very eager for his work and to continue learning from him about the history of the university. As for the students involved in this project, there are 8 undergraduate researchers who are working in small cluster teams around themes as I outlined them. I also want to acknowledge the graduate students who have been affiliated with Hard Histories this semester. Lauren Feldman, who's behind the scenes in our Zoom this afternoon, who is the program coordinator for Hard Histories and is really the person responsible for a lot of our public-facing work, which has included a series of book conversations with authors over the course of the semester. Just this week, we finished up that series with Professor Lawrence Jackson and his work on Frederick Douglass. But Lauren, Mallory Pilat, who is a graduate student in the history department, who's been the teaching assistant and has been hands-on with these student researchers, supporting and encouraging and expanding their work in the archives. And we've also had a series of student hosts for our public events this semester. So we will continue in this model for quite a few semesters to come. If there are young current Hopkins students, please send them our way and enroll. It is true that you need not be a history major or have experience in historical research to be a part of and contribute to the lab. And next year, conditions permitting, will be in a dedicated lab space at the SNF Agora Institute. So it's really going to be an exciting place to be. So thank you for that. The second question is one that it's not the first time I think we've been asked it, but it's such an important one to revisit, which is the question, sort of, how did we get here? One version of the question is, where do these stories come from? You know, how was it that we came to think that Mr. Hopkins was, for example, an abolitionist rather than someone who dealt in enslaved labor? I don't know, Allison, I have thoughts. I know you do too, but you could get us started, because I think it's a really important reflection. You know, how on earth did we get here?
Sure. Yeah, and I think with all things, some things are still to be determined, right? So I think that we are actually in a process of sort of breaking down the narrative that has been built to reiterate that abolitionist, moniker for Johns Hopkins. So I think one of the ways in which I envision how we got here is very much one that is based on this Helen Hopkins Tom book, where people over time just generally have reiterated and told that story and that narrative and repeated it. And I think we see that in other scenarios too. You know, it's not just with Johns Hopkins, the founder, where it's, you know, this ideology of him and his perception of slavery as told by someone in 1929 who is a direct relative of him and sort of has this rose-colored perspective. I think, you know, we've seen that scenario play out with other historic figures where you know, a story has been repeated, so it's become true. And so I think for me, you know, the point of investigation is really figuring out, you know, where in which do we see this transition to people referring to him as an abolitionist? So, you know, is it in written histories of the university? Is it in, newspaper articles? Where does it start appearing that we see this word associated with him? So I think for me, you know, we're still to be determined on where this sort of switch becomes to calling him that. And I do think, you know, it's also crucial to reiterate that sometimes we won't find an answer. I think that it might be obscure, and it might just be the answer is that at some point in time, you know, this narrative had been repeated so much that it became the truth and the story that we tell. So hopefully that is not too far off from where you're thinking is, Martha. And I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, like you, I always begin this with Helen Tom in her 1929 book, Johns Hopkins, Silhouette, an admiring descendant of Hopkins, who relied upon, you know, family recollections largely to paint a picture of someone whom she was concerned was not getting his due by the 1920s. The university had come, the 50th anniversary of the university had come and gone. And I think Tom was worried that he was a figure who was being forgotten and shouldn't be. And but her book was published, and it was published by the university press, which gave it, you know, the kind of, you know, the feel, right, of a history or of a scholarly biography, when it really was a sort of idiosyncratic memoir written by someone who was deeply devoted to Hopkins and to a version of his memory. But we do indeed, it's not the university alone that repeats her stories. Others who chronicle the history of the university in Baltimore repeat versions of Tom's story. And by the time we get to the centennial, then the university is looking to tell a story about itself. And we reach for Tom again, and the story is amplified. The thing I would add to that is, you know, an appreciation for how all sorts of entities and institutions rely upon origin stories that are a mixture of history, a mixture of fact with myth and misunderstanding and even misremembering. I'll preview for folks that in 2026, not only will this university celebrate an anniversary, but the nation will celebrate an anniversary. And you can be sure that we will not agree about how to tell the story of the origins of the United States, what to emphasize, what to set to the side, what is central, what is peripheral, what we remember and what we can know in an archival sense is not unique to Johns Hopkins at all. It is endemic to institutions. And we are, I hope, at the same time, charting a different way forward for ourselves so that by the time we get to 2026, we don't have to reach for threadbare family reminiscences, that we don't have to reach for myths or partial truths or easy generalizations, that we really will be in a position to think about our next 100 years, our next 150 years from a foundation that is rooted in, hard-won research, as you've heard, these student researchers and sort of the way they're laboring, but with a kind of frank appreciation for the complexities of the history of this country and of this institution, and that we're not exceptional. It turns out we are deeply embedded in a complex and in some cases difficult history. So I have tried to be compassionate, right, with us as an institution, and to see the most important work is the work we do going forward, rather than the indictment about what we might have done in the past. I think we have time for one more question, Allison.
Sure.
And I think this is, again, it's coming up in a number of the questions, but I'll try and capture it in a broad stroke. It's just sort of, why does this past matter for the present anyway? Now, I'm a historian, right? So you don't have to sell me, and you are too, right? You don't have to sell us on the unassailable value of historical research and historical knowledge, and we pride ourselves on an institution, on having entities like Hopkins Retrospective, history departments like the one I teach in, as models, right, nationally for the undertaking that we call history today. But I think there's a question still for many folks about how and why this remote history should matter for thinking about who we are today. And I heard the students speaking to that very much, but I'm curious about how you answer that question for yourself or for your own students, or I don't know, maybe your family at Thanksgiving who wonder why you spend so much time in dusty archives.
Yeah. They've often asked that question. I think, it's a fantastic inquiry, Martha, and I appreciate you allowing me to speak to it, because I think as a public historian, that is one of the areas in which I feel most drawn to. So, public history is history beyond the academic classroom. It's beyond the walls of, the academic corridors. And I think what I enjoy about doing this type of work, doing the research, presenting it to the community, allowing the community to share in this idea that they are stakeholders in this history too, and that this belongs to them and they are a part of this. I think that work is incredibly valuable, and I'm really grateful to be able to bring it to Hopkins, because there are many universities that don't have public history components to their curriculum or even in their libraries and archives. So I think for me, the answer is slightly geared towards the students as well. So it's the curiosity and the interest that the students have in this history and how it can be applied to create a better and more inclusive environment in present day. And so I think there are lessons to be learned, and the students very clearly and very easily pick up on those. And then they take those and they create this world in which it's diverse and inclusive and there's equity. So I think that that's one of the things that I feel like doing this historical research really allows is for us to sort of break down those walls and those barriers that have been built of inequity and sort of, this historic sense of this is the way things always were, this is the way they should continue. And so I think for me, that's really where I feel so committed to this work. And so I think that's how I would answer you on that question.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, because I know our time is almost up, that for me, there's something in this work that helps us appreciate how it is that sometimes the work we aim to do, the goals we set for ourselves in the 21st century are difficult to realize. And when we, for example, appreciate, right, the degree and the depth to which separation that turns into segregation is part of the origins of this institution, and is part of what structures it over many generations, we appreciate then why I think it is sometimes difficult to simply flip a switch or decide we want to be a different sort of institution, whether it's in terms of who works here or studies here, or it's in terms of the climate on the campus. We're dealing oftentimes with troubles, hard histories that are deeply entrenched, and the work of extracting them is formidable, worth doing, I'm here to say, but formidable. And I hope that sometimes the histories we tell help us understand better why the work is so difficult. And at the same time, I think there's also extraordinary inspiration. You know, Kelly Miller too often is sort of a one sentence, throwaway about a young man who couldn't pay his tuition. But Kelly Miller goes on to be one of the most consequential social scientists of the early 20th century. And he does so despite the fact that he attended Hopkins at a time when men like Thomas Dixon and Woodrow Wilson were setting the climate for Anglo-Saxonism at Johns Hopkins. And that, I think, is a source of inspiration for us as we think about who we want to be and who we aspire to be. And we only can do that and have that if we fully understand who Miller was and we restore his fullness rather than that throwaway line, right, to our collective memory. So that's my stab at it. But I think we are here for the research in any case, and my hope is that everybody finds their own answer to that question about why this past might matter to them. I'm going to turn it back to. I'm going to thank you, Allison, very much.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you to Eliza Zimmerman and Kevin LaMonica for joining us. And thank you to Susan DeMuth, who's going to take us out this afternoon.
It's a wonderful conversation. Thank you both very, very much. Thank the student presenters for their significant work on the history of this institution and its longstanding legacies relating to race and racism. We'd also like to thank the Johns Hopkins Office of Alumni Relations and Hiro Amano of Open Range Video for supporting this event, and are very grateful for the SNF Agora Institute infrastructural support of hard histories, including providing the template format for this event. We wish everyone in our audience safety and health, and we very much appreciate you joining us here today. Stay safe, be well. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.